There are several quote-unquote games which, in actuality, present potential players with a game engine. Most notable of these are tabletop role-playing games where the game is designed and created by the game master. The narrative belongs to all of the players, but the game itself, the rules of the game world, are the providence of the game master. The handbook provides a rule set, and there are modules which create an adventure and a world within which for the game to take place, but as the handbook states, the game master is the arbiter of those rules, deciding when to follow them and when to ignore them in favor of the aesthetic or the rule of cool. Tabletop role-playing games provide a framework for games in which the major mechanics are the people playing them. They are not the only games which do this. To some extent, you could say all games do this, as they don't exist without player input, but they are the games in which the player mechanic has the most sway over how the game goes. A game of Klondike Solitaire will play out just about the same no matter who is the one playing, but the lost minds of Phandelver can vary wildly from group to group. There is another set of games which feature the players as prominent mechanics, social deduction games. Unlike tabletop role-playing games, these can be played right out of the sometimes literal box, and what it asks of the player is not to create an entire game more or less within the bounds of its framework, nor to simply follow along within its rigid bounds. What a social deduction game asks of the players is to deduce, and by extension, to lie. Hello world, my name is Atticus, and welcome to the experiment. Most social deduction games follow a similar gameplay loop. Every player receives a role of some sort. These are usually villain and civilian, and perhaps a few intermediaries. The goal of the villains is to get rid of all the civilians, and likewise the goal of the civilians is to get rid of all the villains. Usually, the villains know who the other villains are, and so can work together, while the civilians possess no such benefit. After the roles are handed out, the gameplay continues with two cycles, action and discussion. Roles with an action perform that action, usually with a set order, such as selecting a player to protect or selecting a player to remove from the game, usually within the fiction as having been killed by the actor. Once all actions have happened, a discussion phase begins where the players attempt to deduce who among them is a villain, and the villains attempt to hide their identity while throwing suspicion on everyone else. The end of the discussion phase typically includes the players voting one person out. This continues until all of one side is completely wiped out. So that's how a game goes, but what does it ask the player to actually do? That depends mostly on what role they're given. As a civilian, a player wants to convince the other players that they are innocent, and to figure out which players are the villains. This role requires no deception, but it does ask for deduction. Villains also want to convince the other players that they are innocent, but this time, it does require deception. But we'll get to the neat psychology stuff in a bit. On occasion, there are other roles, either civilians with actions, villains with or without actions, or neutral parties. In One Night Ultimate Werewolf, there exists a Minion Role to the main villains, the werewolves. This role gets to know which players are werewolves, but the werewolves do not learn who is a minion. The minions win if the werewolves win, so their goal becomes to convince the other players that the werewolves are innocent. Ideally, they'll also convince the players of their own innocence, but since they lose if the werewolves are outed, they become top priority. There's also the role of Tanner, separate from both werewolves and civilians. The Tanner wins if they die, and the werewolves can't win if the Tanner does. This creates an interesting situation where a player has to act suspicious enough to get voted out, but not suspicious enough that other players suspect them of being the Tanner. There are, of course, other roles depending on the game, but civilian and villain are the main ones, and Tanner, or Jester, is a common addition. Deception, as a mechanic, presents some interesting challenges. When the goal of the game is to learn, to deduce the truth from limited information, knowledge becomes incredibly valuable. But when any statement could easily be a lie meant to throw the player off the right trail, the challenge becomes sifting through a mountain of information and searching for discrepancies or reading the subtle body language of the other players to see if they are lying. For the civilians, the challenge and fun is in playing the role of detective, scrutinizing all information and reaching the truth. For the villains, the challenge and fun is in playing the role of the deceiver and crafting a believable falsehood. But lying is not so simple as stating, "I'm innocent." From the premise of a social deduction game, every player knows that there is at least one villain. The set of shared knowledge is small, but that is part of it. Other things are the possible roles a player can have. Consider the card game Coup. Like most social deduction games, every player gets a role. But in this version, there are no sides, it's every player for themselves. And in addition, each player gets 2 roles. The roles all have special actions they can perform, and the goal is to be the last player standing. On a turn, a player may perform any action that a role card can offer, whether or not they possess that role. Another player can challenge that action if they believe that the acting player does not possess that card. If the acting player does not have that role, then they lose one of their role cards, and if they have no role cards, they are out of the game. If the challenge is made erroneously, the challenger loses a role card. At the start of the game, all players have roughly the same information: what roles are in play, how many of each, and what roles they themselves have. The lies here are simple, whether or not a player has the role for the action they're using. The deductions come more from probability and behavior over a number of rounds. Do all 3 players really have the Admiral, or is one of them lying? If one player claims 3 roles, one of those was clearly a lie, but which one? There is a bit of deduction from playing with the same people repeatedly and learning the meta, how each player tends to play their cards, but without a fairly obvious tell, it is simple enough to claim an action to be available. Additionally, stating, "I'm going to do X," is not necessarily a lie, in the way that "I have X role card, so I'm going to do Y action" can be. Compare that to One Night Ultimate Werewolf, where everyone receives a role card and then performs various actions. One Night lives up to its name by having games only run for a single round, so civilians only have to correctly find one villain, while all villains have to conceal their identity. The problem is that some roles switch players' role cards around, so by the end of the action phase, a given player may not be on the same side they started on. Players all start with the knowledge of what roles are in play and what they started with, then a player knows what they did during the action phase. From this bare bones amount of knowledge, a player has to both piece together what side they are on and figure out whom to place suspicion on based on the stories going around. Again, it's simple enough to claim, "I was a villager," and focus on unraveling the events of the action phase, but then you can't influence the narrative without casting doubt on yourself. And that simple statement could be a lie, unlike Coup's "I'm going to do X." And when lying, not only does a player have to worry about the content of their fabrication, but the delivery as well. There is a language of deception, a linguistic style that people adopt when telling falsehoods. This happens because lying is fundamentally different from telling the truth. It takes effort to create a believable story, which leaves less cognitive power in constructing the tale. This can result in the presence of more motion verbs such as walk or carry, because they present simple, concrete actions and are readily accessible, as opposed to more cognitive verbs like believe or think, which can be more complex and demand more from the storyteller. This language may not be universal. The study I'm referencing concedes that their findings are more than likely not applicable across languages, and indeed may only apply to American English. But it is an interesting topic to look into nonetheless. The key takeaways that Newman, Pennebaker, Berry, and Richards found was that liars tended to avoid using first or third person pronouns. they used more negative words, fewer exclusionary words, and more motion verbs. The third-person pronouns are a bit of an oddity, so we'll address those last. But the theorizing behind these findings posits that people telling falsities feel guilt about it, and so they attempt to distance themselves from the events within their lives by not referencing themselves, the lack of first-person pronoun usage. Additionally, their language turns more negative as they feel guilt during the telling or immediately after. Finally, the act of lying is more cognitively taxing than the act of telling the truth, as believable events have to be fabricated and then told, so purveyors of falsehoods don't use exclusionary terms such as except or but, because that creates a clear distinction between things that did and did not happen. And the speaker is already working to create a tale of what did happen, so to focus on and speak of what did not happen in their made-up reality would be an extra bit of mental effort that could be better utilized crafting and telling a believable lie. And as mentioned previously, the motion verbs are simpler to use and more readily accessible. For the matter of third-person pronouns, the study notes that the existing literature on the language of deception expects liars to use more third-person pronouns than those telling the truth, again an extension of distancing themselves from the lie. The findings in this study could be related to the context of the lies, or in the fact that liars were encouraged to make their tales believable, and so perhaps they opted for more proper nouns than pronouns to create a more fully realized reality. This mentally taxing experience of spinning a tall tale is one half of the challenge and core gameplay of social deduction games, the other half being spotting the lies. I know people who enjoy certain social deduction games, but absolutely detest being cast as the villain because of how stressful it can be. Lying is no easy feat, and neither is catching a liar. Not only did the study compile an overview of language used for deception, it also created a classifier that, when given an input of some text file, would determine if the content was a lie or not. And overall, that classifier was correct 61% of the time, which is a fair bit better than random chance, or a success rate of 50%. Human judges looking over the same data were correct only 52% of the time. Functionally, they were simply guessing. But a closer look at the data found that the human judges tended to err in favor of believing something to be true rather than false, predicting true upwards of 70% of the time whether the content was true or false. And that's what makes social deduction games so fun. It's difficult to both tell a lie and to spot one, so regardless of which side a player is on, it feels rewarding to succeed. Even if the language of deception outlined above is not applicable to a given group playing a social deduction game, there is almost certainly some language of deception, and the more that group plays together, the more its members will begin to pick up on it, creating a meta for that group and social deduction games. Despite that excellent segue into this segment, I feel like I should note that this is a tangent. If you clicked on for the Among Us content, first of all, thanks for making it this far. I know it's been a fair while. And second, here's the timestamp for when I start talking about Among Us. While doing a modicum of research for this video, I stumbled across an article which used words like ludology and pedagogical toolbox, and I wanted to feel like Daryl Talks Games. Also, and aside for the tangent about something a bit more in my wheelhouse, ludology uses a Latin root word and a Greek suffix, which I personally find fun, and also a smart move for the study of games, since if it was all Greek, I believe the word would be agonology, which simply does not sound pleasant. And all Latin would be something like Ludo Studio, which sounds like a game engine more than a field of study. This article considered the use of social deduction games as a teaching tool for social communication and small group dynamics. Small group communication is any communication between members of a group ranging from 3 to 20 people that are all working towards a common goal. There are 4 different types of groups, but the ones we are focused on would be the task-oriented one, the type of group you might find in most classrooms. As the article points out, all groups have 5 stages they go through during their existence, with the first and last stages being formation and dissolution respectively. The second stage is called storming, where conflicts occur as the group is brought together. Next is norming, where those differences are resolved and priorities are ordered. Finally, the 4th stage is the performing of whatever goals are established in the previous stage. A social deduction game is nothing but small group communication. The group is formed at the start of the game and dissolved at the end. Conflicts arise as players share dissenting information. Consensus is hopefully reached in the norming stage, so that in the performing stage, the group can get a majority vote on which among them has the role of villain. And small group communication is more than just creating and maintaining relationships. As the group works towards a collective goal, there are also elements of leadership, which alone can potentially determine success or failure. I know in the games I've played there tends to be 1 or 2 players that speak the most, taking control of the narrative as they try to pinpoint which player to vote on. If it's 2 players, usually there's 1 from each group. With a task-oriented group, there are also notes of problem-solving as the group sifts through all the available information and works together-ish to determine truth from lies before ultimately coming to a consensus. There's a lot to learn about how small groups communicate by participating in them, and social deduction games provide just such an opportunity. However, the potential to learn is even greater when there's someone that actually knows what they're talking about, who can explain the intricacies of what just happened that caused everyone to vote for that one specific player. Games, in general, can be a great tool in the classroom when used effectively. I still remember far too much about the Council of Nicaea and the Catalan Conspiracy because I took 2 classes during my college years in which we played out the events of those 2 moments in history. Our version did not play out much the same as the real-life counterpart, but the framing of the lesson has caused it to stick with me far longer than, say, linear algebra. That's the end of the tangent. I did not mean for it to go on for 2 pages, but it is apparently something I find really interesting. I'd recommend reading through the article if you also found this somewhat intriguing, as there's a lot there that I didn't cover because this section is already too long. References to both articles I mentioned are in the description. Among Us is another social deduction game, but one that takes place in a virtual space, and, more importantly, was designed for a virtual space. Most social deduction games are card or board based, and while there are some maps or mods in games like Warcraft 3 or StarCraft 2, those are notably mods. The base game was not designed with this in mind, and the mods have to work around that. I don't want to sound overly disparaging to StarCraft 2's Phantom mod or the custom Warcraft 3 maps, however, because I've not played them, and they could be excellent social deduction experiences despite the design of the base game. But the base game is still something that has to be worked around. The core gameplay of Among Us works much like I outlined earlier, except everyone participates in the action phase simultaneously, and instead of that action happening around a table, it takes place on an in-game map. Civilians, or crewmates, attempt to complete a list of tasks that they receive at the start of the match, while the villains, or imposters, try and get away with murder. The crewmates win if they complete all of their tasks, or if they successfully vote out all imposters, while imposters win if their number equals that of the crewmates. One thing which Among Us lacks in comparison to other social deduction games is the ability to see the other players, and in some instances, such as playing with strangers in a public lobby, also the ability to hear other players. Beyond the language of deception, there exist other key signals in body language, inflection, and tone that can aid other players in determining if what that player just said was true or false. In Among Us, there is only the text chat option, but the game makes up for that lack of information by providing new information, knowledge of what happened during the action phase. Players can see each other as they run around and can keep track of what everyone is doing. The game encourages this with mechanics such as the cameras on the Skeld and Polis maps, the admin table, and the logs in Mira, enabling the players to have a broad overview of what's going on around the map. The admin table, for example, informs anyone looking at it how many people are in each room. If one player is watching the admin table for most of the round, when the discussion phase occurs, they might be able to catch the imposter in a lie if they claim to be in a room that was empty, in order to make it seem like they were farther away than they actually were. With the ability to corroborate stories that happen in a virtual space, the crewmates have the ability to catch any falsehoods that imposters may try to sell. Ultimately, deception works incredibly well as a mechanic due in no small part to the psychology behind lying. Games such as Among Us and Project Winter have shown that these social deduction experiences work even in a virtual space, where the amount of information a player has at their disposal to catch lies is ostensibly even less than in tabletop-based games of the same genre. However, where One Night Ultimate Werewolf would not work as well over a Discord call when compared to in person, games designed to exist solely in a virtual space can design with those challenges in mind, creating engaging and enjoyable experiences unique to them. I have been Atticus, and thank you for participating.